All right, well, I think we're going to get started. And so I just wanted to introduce Terri. Terri is one of our volunteers in the museum and is an excellent source for genealogy. And so this is just going to be a really good intro program if you're just looking for really how to get started. If you have, maybe you've hit a kind of glitch and you're not quite sure where to go from there. And so we are going to get started. And I want to say thank you to Terri for doing this program for us. And I'm going to pass it over to Terri and start the program.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, Brandon, for all the setup this morning. And welcome, everyone. We're glad to have you with us, and we are hoping that this will be the first in a hopefully good series of genealogy programs that will be presented virtually. So without further ado, let's get started and look for some of the records and resources that you can use to climb your family tree. Whoops, excuse me. First thing we're going to do is look at some definitions. Genealogy is the collecting of the names of our ancestors. And while we concentrate mostly on our ancestors, we cannot forget about the descendants. They are equally as important, and they are the cousins that you will have to interview and to talk to that may have participated in different events with the grandparents, or who have attended the same event that you did, but have distinctly different memories. Family history is the collecting of the stories about your ancestors. And these are the things that add depth to the story of their lives. And as we say, it put meat on the bones of your ancestors. Present day genealogy for the United States dates back to the early 16th century. King Henry VIII was married to Catherine of Aragon, and he wanted a new wife, Anne Boleyn. So he divorced Catherine, and with that, the Church of England broke from the Church in Rome. And with that break, it then became a requirement that parishes throughout the United Kingdom would register baptisms, marriages, and burials. These new records for the first time pertain to all of the people, not just the upper class and royalty. And that's where we get ours. Since we were English, for the most part, English settlements, we adopted these same procedures. How to get started? The best thing is to start with the present and work backwards in a systematic fashion. When I say start with the present, you want to start with yourself. You want to record yourself, your parents, your grandparents, and systematically work backwards. You also want to look at one family at a time. So you probably want to start maybe with your father or your mother's families and work until you run into what we call a brick wall. Then you want to move over to the other family. What you have to realize is that you only have 2 parents, but you have 4 grandparents and 8 great-grandparents, and so on. So this information doubles at each generation. So there will be that many more names for you to pursue. The purpose in all of this is to discover the truth. Many of us have family myths, and in some cases they are truths, about having Native American ancestry, or there were 3 brothers that came on a ship and settled in New England. One of them was disheartened and went south. One went west to seek opportunity, and one stayed behind. Did we really have those 3 brothers, and did they really disperse around the country? So we want to discover the truth in all of these stories. Don't take anything for granted. You may have heard some of these stories come down through the family, and you need to find the proof. My mother frequently told us that her grandmother's name was Leda Caron, And it turns out that there is an element of truth to all of this. Her grandmother was Leda, but the last name was Tremblay, not Caron. She did have Caron cousins, so there was a mix-up there. We have two forms that we use to assist you with organization. The first one is the pedigree chart or an ancestral chart or a lineage chart. They're all three the same. And the second one is a family group sheet. And we're going to take a little bit of a look at each one of these forms. These forms are available for free at ancestry.com. If you just do a simple search for family group sheet, Ancestry will be one of the choices that comes up to download that chart for free. Here is the ancestral chart, and this is what you're going to use to record your direct line ancestors. Your direct line ancestors are your parents, your grandparents, great-grandparents. It does not include what we call the collateral relatives, who are your aunts and uncles and cousins. So you want to start with yourself being number one and record as much information, hopefully all of the information that you know about your place of birth, your date of birth, your date of marriage, where you were married, and who you might have married, the name of your spouse. Number two on the upper part of the chart is always going to be your father. The male relatives are always going to be even numbered. The females will always be +1, the odd numbers. So your father will be number two, record all of his information. Your mother will be number three, record all of hers. 4 and 5 will be your father's parents. His father, number 4, his mother, number 5. 6 and 7 will be your mother's parents, your mother's father, and your mother's mother, and so on. 8, 9 will be great-grandparents, your grandfather's parents, or yes, your grandfather's parents. Number 10 and 11 will be your grandmother's parents. 12 and 13 will be your maternal grandparents' parents, and number 14 and 15 will be your maternal grandmother's parents. So as I said, these will be your direct line ancestors. Then we have a family group record. This will allow you to record the aunts, uncles, and cousins. Here again, you want to start with yourself. If you're the female, you want to record yourself as the wife, and if you have a husband, you want to record the husband. And any children that you have will be recorded in the lower portion. You want to record as much of the information as you possibly have, as far as birth dates, marriage dates, and the places that these events occurred. When you get back in the generations, perhaps to grandparents or great-grandparents, you may not know the birth order of the children. So that's when you want to record them, but you can put a check mark in the box at the side or an X to indicate your direct line ancestor. You're going to want a family group record for each family group. So if someone married more than once, if there was a second husband or a second wife, and they had children, you want to record them on a completely separate sheet because they are a different family group. You will find with the deaths of women, especially during childbirth, or husbands due to accidents or short lifespans, it is not unusual for grandparents, great-grandparents, etc., to marry more than once. in some cases, even 3 or 4 times. And you want to record their family, their individual family group. Here again, with the children, you want to record their births, the year that they were born, and if you know any of the spouses. If there's any additional information, religious affiliation, military service, you can always use the back of the form to record this information. You don't want to lose any information. So how can you ensure that you're successfully researching your family and not the other Smith family? Here again, this is one reason that we want to start with ourselves and systematically work backwards. If you jump in trying to trace John Smith, who was born in 1850, and work forward, you may be doing the genealogy. It may not just be your family genealogy that you're doing. So work backwards. We want to start at home, looking for the stuff that we have in our house that we can collect that will give us genealogy information. Hopefully, you know where your birth certificate is, where any marriage license you might have, and hopefully maybe you have this information as well for your parents or your grandparents. If there are any family heirlooms that might have come down through the generations, do you have a piece of furniture that belonged to your grandmother or from your parents' home? Do you have something as simple as a recipe or a charm bracelet, piece of jewelry, something treasured that came from the previous generation? Photographs are another wonderful resource. And in many cases, we have photographs, but we don't necessarily know who's in them. But collect all that information and see how much of it you can document before branching out to other resources. You want to document where you found the information. I can guarantee you that after a short period of time, you're going to go back and you're going to look for the same thing over again. So if you find something, make sure you document exactly where you found it, because you are going to want to go back and look at any records that you might have found online, or to read some of the documents to find out where is someone buried, who was the funeral home that they might have used, and other pertinent information. You want to interpret the information that you do find. What does it mean when you find something? For example, if you're looking at census records and you find that your relative lived in Maryland in the mid 1800s, but then the next census you find them living in Illinois, is it the correct family? And why did they move? Did the land play out? Were they farmers? And since there were no fertilizers in the mid 1800s, were they forced to move to get better land? Did a relative die and they moved to be closer to, for example, a daughter and her husband, or an older relative? So there are many things to look at when interpreting the information. You want to also analyze the information. When you find new information, does it make sense when you add it to what you already know? An example in my personal family is my great-grandmother. I had her in one census, and in another census, I found her, but she was married to a different man. And I wondered, is this indeed the same and correct person? Is it my great-grandmother? It turns out that in subsequent information, I found a death record, a church record for the death of my great-grandfather. And 2 years later, my great-grandmother remarried, and indeed, this was the correct information. So you have to analyze what you find. Are there new and different children? I had a friend that, in doing some research, found the ages of a wife were significantly different, and she couldn't make sense of it. Well, it turns out that her grandfather had married a Lucy for his first marriage, and when she died, he married a second woman with the same name, Lucy. And while she was significantly younger, it was indeed her grandfather. So you have to look at the information and analyze to see how it fits. When you do obtain the information and you have verified that it is part of your family, you want to record this newfound information. I record a lot of the information in pencil. I do a lot of work in pencil, or I download information from the internet and keep it in files. When I do get the final assurance and proof, then I enter it into what I have a database on my computer, or you can enter it then in pen on paper records. So what resources do you have in your home? Do you have a family Bible that might record births, marriages, and deaths? In this particular example, we have a family Bible from the Wagner family, and you'll notice that the first number of people are Wagner GN, and the last three on the list have added an O in the spelling of their names, but apparently they're part of the same family. The other thing we look at is the birth dates, and we see that Albert and Lacey are older, and we assume that the rest of these Wagners are their children. But that's an assumption. It could be cousins, nieces and nephews. Family Bibles record births for usually more than just the integral family. They may record those cousins, the aunts and uncles, especially in the marriages and deaths. So you need other information to confirm the family group. But hopefully you might have a family Bible with this information. We spoke about photographs earlier. Do you have any photographs, and can you identify the people that are in them? The photograph on the left is my grandfather, and it was taken on his marriage. The photograph on the right, I actually found on the internet, and it happens to be one of my grandfather's sisters. And the photograph was taken probably in the early 1900s. Fortunately, the photograph came from a photographer's studio that had been purchased by an online resource, and they were making those available to the public. So the people in the photograph were identified and are available for purchase. Something as simple as a report card. This report card happened to belong to a neighbor of mine. He was 94 years old, and he had every one of his report cards. This one is from level 1, his first grade report card. So look for those. Do you have honor roll information? Are there other things around your house? I would kill for a diary from one of my ancestors, but I had no such luck. There are family keepsakes. You know, we talked about a piece of furniture or a charm bracelet. This happens to be a document from a friend of mine, and it was a simple pin, but she read some of the stories from her ancestors and from some of the letters that were passed down, and she was able to come up with a brief history of the pin, as well as a photograph of the woman who used the pin. So it can be something very, very small and what we consider insignificant. When we want to branch out and do the genealogy and find the proof, what types of information are available to us? For the most part, in the US, we turn to census records. We've been doing censuses from 1790 forward. Many of us filled out census forms this year. They will not be available to the public or open to the public until 72 years in the future. So the current census that is available is the 1940 census. However, next year, the Privacy Act allows for the 1950 census to be open to the public. So there's going to be a huge influx of records onto the internet for the 1950 census records. We want to look also at vital records. Those are your birth, marriage, and death, as well as cemetery records. Some of the vital records come in the form of church records, especially earlier records, and they will be baptisms, marriages, and burials. Vital records did not come into, there is no national level recording of vital records. It was up to each one of the states. And the movement to record these records didn't occur until starting in the 1880s. While they do exist for some of the earlier colonies, as well as for the early states in the 1700s, the vast majority of them are not available until the 1900s, and even as late as 1920. So if you're looking for a birth record in 1750, you're probably going to have a great deal of difficulty. That's where that family Bible comes into play. Courthouse records. We like to go to the courthouse to find land records. Land records are going to tell you when your family members moved into an area and when they sold their land to move to a different area. So it's important once you find a census record, when did they actually arrive, especially if they are moving and moving westward. You want to look at those land records. Many of them are not available on the internet. You have to actually travel or inquire at the courthouse in their locality to find this information. When land is purchased, for the most part, the men's names are recorded. But when land is sold, we find the woman's name recorded. And there may also be other records embedded in land records. Wills are another big thing that are in the courthouse. Some of them are appearing on the internet, but many of them are still available at the courthouse. Wills are going to tell you who received property, whether it be real or land records or inventory information. But what you're really hoping for kind of is someone who died without a will. Without a will, intestate we call that, they are required to identify all of the people that might have a claim against the estate. And this is where you find many of the relatives that are off on the side and whether they actually received anything from the estate. Without a will, they also take inventories, an inventory of all the goods that may be in the household, as well as the land. So you're going to find farm implements, you're going to find tablecloths, you're going to find chairs, you're going to find chests. And in my own personal case, in the late 1600s, I found an inventory for one of my ancestors, and it included pins. It turns out that she was an immigrant, and pins were a very valuable commodity because you just couldn't make them. So it appeared in the inventory that she had a certain number of pins. It will give you an idea of the prosperity or the lack thereof of your family members. It also may include animals, how many head of cattle they might have had. Military records. Do you have ancestors that served in the military? There are a number of records that we find that do the registration for the draft in World War I and World War II, for example. But predating that, there are also records of enlistments. There are huge volumes that record those people that entered and exited. And for example, during the Civil War, they used something that were called muster rolls when they actually entered a particular unit and when they left that unit. If they changed units, they would muster out of their old unit and muster into their new unit. It will give you information as to what unit they actually served with, as well as did they die in service or were they released from service after a certain period of time. Immigration records. Were your ancestors immigrants? For most of us, unless we have that Native American ancestry, we do have at least one immigrant in the family, probably many more. There are ship lists that exist. However, they're very, very scant for the early part of the country. For example, before we became the United States, people just got off the ship. The colonies were English colonies, and if they came from England, there was no need for them to require a ship list. However, if they were German, they might have recorded the information and they might have actually gone through a primitive naturalization process. There are 3 forms of records for the naturalization process to look for, and they will give you hints as to perhaps what the ship that they actually came on. Ship lists are very hard to work with unless the family came as a family unit. But if they came at single, one at a time, it's very difficult to separate your ancestor from someone else with the exact same name. Passports. Passports have existed since about 1793. And the reason for them was, especially for men, was if they were an immigrant and they wanted to visit the old country, they did not want to be conscripted into the old country's military. So they applied for and received a passport to show that they were Americans. Newspapers and books. These are valuable resources for family history as well. Births, marriages, funerals, and deaths used to be recorded in newspapers. Now that newspapers cost, or advertising space costs so much, we don't find the births recorded quite as frequently. But hopefully, if your ancestor came from a small town, you might find, honor roll. Did the Glee Club participate in something? Sporting events. And can you find your ancestor in those records? City directories. City directories were created for businesses. They predate the telephone book, and they were still issued once the telephone did come into being. But the city directory was created for businesses, and it was for businessmen to be able to identify who their potential purchasers were going to be. City directories will also give you a listing of the streets in a town, and many towns renamed their streets, and they will give you the correspondence of those renamed streets. They will give you listings of churches, social organizations, schools, and who might have been the principal in each one of the schools, and who worked for some of those individual businesses. So they are a valuable resource. They also give you what the home address of that person was. So they fill in between those census years, especially in small towns and larger cities. Society publications, historical societies, genealogical societies, they usually produced publications for their specific locality. Genealogy societies are always willing to take Bible records from wherever in the country they might be recorded. It's one of the assets that is of such significant importance that they will take them from anywhere and publish them in their local society publication. So let's take a look at some of these. This is an example of the 1900 census, and you can see how much information there is in the census. We get really, really excited when we find our relatives in the census with their names, the list, the husband and wife identified, and the list of their children. And we think, oh, wow, we've got them. Take the time to read all of the columns in the census because there is hidden information in each one of the censuses. The censuses are different prior to 1850, the 1840 and backwards. It's just the head of the household that is recorded. Starting in 1850, they recorded every person that was in the household. They didn't always give the relationship of that person, and in some cases, those relationships are not recorded correctly. But make sure to look at every single column for the data that is going to be hidden there. Were your parents or were your people immigrants? What year did they immigrate? How many children did they have? When were they married? There are clues for all of these things. Did they attend school within the last year? Did they participate in military service? These are all things that will lead you to more records to look for. Just so that you know, not only was there the US Census, there are state and territorial censuses. Most of the state censuses occur in the 55, 65, the years that end in 5. Not necessarily true. In New York, there was an 1892 census. Territorial censuses were usually conducted immediately prior to the territory applying for statehood. Just so that you know also, other countries recorded census information as well. So if you have immigrant ancestors, you may find them in their native census records. Birth, marriage, and death certificates. Just so that you know, there are regular birth certificates, but there's also something called a delayed birth certificate. With the advent of Social Security, people had to have proof that they were turning 65 years of age. So that's when delayed birth certificates came about. If someone was born at home in the late 1800s, they would apply for a delayed birth certificate. From this particular example, we see that Alfred was born in 1893, but at the bottom we see that this form was actually filled out in 1957 when he was 64 years old, getting ready to apply for Social Security. It gives the information about who his father was and his mother's maiden name as well as other pertinent information. Marriage records. We're familiar with marriage licenses and marriage certificates and marriage registers, but know that there are other forms of marriage records as well. This is simply a marriage intention from 1846 announcing that Samuel Philbrook intends to marry Lydia Moulton and where they are. It does not mean that the marriage actually took place, but know that there are other forms of marriage records beyond the certificate. There are also death registers. There are birth registers as well. The death registers probably recorded, or many recorded, prior to death certificates. Some of them are from larger communities, and they do list the date, the person's name, their age, and in many cases what the ailment was that they died from, where they died, and where they might be buried, who the attending physician was. So there's some valuable information in death registers as well. Cemeteries, there are headstones, but sometimes your relative doesn't have a headstone. And in some cases, there are headstones, but there are multiple burials in the plot. Here's a cemetery lot card that is available in a cemetery office. And it gives a listing of all the people. There happen to be 12 plots in this lot. So writing to a cemetery office to find out all the people that might be buried in the cemetery is extremely helpful. Here again, we have the ages of each of the people, but we see different names, and we then have to puzzle out the relationship of each one of these people. But it's a valuable clue. We talked about courthouses and land records. The grantors are the people that are selling. The grantees are the people that are buying. And you'll notice that H.E. and Mary White Knight are selling their land. Here we have the woman's name in the sale of the land. It's going to point you to a deed book and the page within the book. And that's valuable information. That's where the actual deed record is going to be recorded. Looking down in the list, most of the date of the deed and the records themselves are filed within a short period of time. But there are also cases where this information might be recorded 20 years in the future. In many cases, land records might not have been recorded until they were getting ready to sell the land. You'll notice on the left, extreme left, a number of DOs listed there. That just stands for ditto, and you will find this also in census records. So the people in the whole list all have the same last name. Tax rolls. We tend to overlook tax rolls. And here again, it's usually only the men that appear on the tax rolls. But it does also give you a listing of what they owned and what was taxable. One of the main reasons to use tax rolls, and it presents a little bit of difficulty, is especially in the 17 and early 1800s, before the census recorded every name in the family. This would usually tell you when a son turned or attained his majority. He might not be on a tax roll in 1759, but by 1760, he's on a tax roll, which means that he attained his majority. You then have to realize what was the age of majority for that particular state at that particular time. Was it 18? Was it 21? So tax rolls can be a valuable resource as well. It's going to tell you also how prosperous the family was and what kinds of ownership they had, how many bushels of wheat or corn or what have you were they growing. When we look at wills, there are also things, guardianship papers, for example. And it turns out that in the 1800s, women who were widows had to apply for guardianship of their own children. And that's the example that we see here. In many cases, it will tell you when the husband or the wife died, and it will give you the family group. And it will record the children for the most part that are under the age of 18. It might include other children as well. So valuable information there. We have the World War I draft registrations that if you don't have a birth date for someone born in the late 1800s, this might give you the clue as to who they are. And it's going to list their next of kin, where they were working at the time. It's also going to give you a physical description. It's not a complete one, but it will tell you whether they were short, medium, or tall, what their hair and eye color was, and what their conformation was. Were they thin, medium, or fat? This is the register of enlistments that we were talking about earlier. And it's a listing for the Army, and I'm not sure what year this one is actually from, but it gives you a complete listing of all the people whose last names begin with C. It's just a single page, who actually enlisted them. It will give you a physical description as well. How tall is the person? And what unit were they assigned to? And in the remarks column, it will tell you whether they were discharged, whether they actually died in service, and where they might be buried. I found out that one of my New York relatives is actually buried in the Marietta, Georgia National Cemetery from one of these registers of enlistment. The muster rolls we talked about earlier also will show you a person's name, what their rank was, and what unit they actually are entering. It will give you the date that they entered that particular unit. There will be a muster roll for when they leave that particular unit. If they receive a promotion, there will be another muster roll card. If they transfer units, there will be another muster roll card. So for military service, you can track the people, especially prior to World War I. You can track them very, very thoroughly. And I have a military relative that was in for over 43 years, and I know where he was for 43 consecutive years, every month of the year. Ship passenger lists, we talked about these. Ellen Cooney, who is the fourth person down on the list, happens to be my relative. She came singly. So when I first found this, there are hundreds of Ellen Cooneys. What made me think that this was my Ellen Cooney was, number one, her age. She corresponds to the age that I'm aware of. And she lists Albany as a destination, and she did settle in that particular area. What I'm most concerned about was, okay, was she really mine? And what finally made me suppose this is further down on the ship list is a James McMulkin. Ellen actually married James McMulkin later on in Troy, New York. So I am assuming that this is indeed the same person and that she met on the ship coming over from Ireland. There are declarations of intention. That's the first of the forms of immigration. This one just happens to be for Albert Einstein. Gives his wife and his children and the years that they were born. And for me, the most interesting point on this was he's immigrating from Bermuda, not Germany. Passport applications, a real messy one, but this is a relative of mine, Dosha Cooney. It tells where she was born in Missouri. It tells us that her husband is deceased. And on the backside, it gives physical description as well as a small picture in the lower right-hand corner. So where do we find this information? First thing you want to do is talk to family members. They are a valuable source of the information. They have attended some of the same events you have. They have attended some of the events that you have not been invited to, but they can give you information about aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, and some of the shared family members. The internet is the most valuable source that we have at this particular time. And we'll look at a couple of the sites that have the most information. Your local library, your local genealogical or history society are also going to provide valuable information that may not be on the internet, but will pertain to the local specific community. The federal and state archives. The federal archives have gone for the most part to using Ancestry.com, but know that each one of the archives holds specific records. For example, the one in Fort Worth, Texas has the Dawes rolls, which are Indian rolls. The one in Georgia contains the World War I draft registration cards. There's one here in Denver. So they each contain the original source data for a particular entity. State archives contain a lot of information and do have websites. A lot of them have indexes where you can find at least personal information about, when your people might have been born. Here again, it's just an index, so you would have to write for the individual record and find out, is it indeed your relative? The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church, has family history centers in most communities, and they too have gone to using Ancestry.com, but do have rolls of microfilm available for various things at their particular site. Fraternal organizations and alumni associations may produce volumes that contain the listing of their members and may provide information about them. We did talk initially a little bit about direct and collateral lines, and we want to make sure that we don't skip over those collateral lines. Those cousins did share the same grandparents, and they might have more information, they might have memories, they might have stories that you in your particular family do not have. They might also have pictures. So this collateral lines are a very valuable resource. Your grandfather, as an example, might have been a farmer of virtually no distinction in his particular area, but he might have had a brother that might have been a large landowner or a prominent member of the community, and there might be information about his ancestry that also applies to you. We have many resources on the internet. There are hundreds of genealogy websites. And if you do a simple search for the best genealogy sites, best free genealogy sites, you will find hundreds of them listed. Most people turn to Ancestry.com and FamilySearch.org. Ancestry is a subscription service, but many of the libraries throughout the country. Our local library here in Canyon City, Colorado, does have access to Ancestry.com, and you can use their resources for free of charge. Family Search is a free website, has a lot of census information, birth, marriage, and death records. And while a lot of the information on Family Search is duplicated in Ancestry, each of these two sites do contain some unique information that the other does not have. So I would recommend using both of these sites heavily. Find a Grave is a simple free site that contains cemetery records. Billion Graves is another one that contains cemetery records and will give you a lot of information. The US GenWeb is a free volunteer site where records are uploaded. They are organized by state, county, and it will depend on what type of volunteers and what type of records they upload. Fold 3 is pretty much, it's a subscription website. It does have some census records, but it's primarily a military record site. And one of their main things that they have is War of 1812 records. And Chronicling America is the Library of Congress website, and it's a free website where you can look up newspapers. They have a vast collection of newspapers. You can look at family trees on Ancestry as a source of information. Unless they actually provide source data, I would take these with a grain of salt. It is up to you to prove the relationship in all of these. You can download this information or you can look at this information, but know that there are many errors in the files, as well as some good information. Use it as a guideline, but get your own proof. Family Search has a very similar situation. They have family trees that will give you your family member, their children, and the previous generation. You'll note that in the center it says sources. There are 6 sources. Look at each one of those to see whether the information is there and what type of information it provides to find the proof. You want to download those records and save those records, print them out, or Find a Grave we talked about. This happens to be the image for my father-in-law. It has a picture of him. Here again, this is a site that is volunteer. People upload the information, so not all of them have a picture. Many of them do have pictures of the tombstones, but here they've uploaded a picture of my father-in-law as well as his obituary. They may also give you connections to the family and who the ancestors were and where their grave sites are. The US GenWeb, you'll notice, as I said, was set up by state. And then you look within the state at the county and you'll see how much or how little information. Many of them give cemeteries, census information, and here again, it's totally volunteer. Fold 3 gives you the military records. This happens to be from the Civil War. That will be payment cards and other forms for the Revolutionary War. It might give you DAR information of their service. So it is a valuable site and it is available at the Mormon Family History Centers free of charge. Chronicling America is the newspaper site, and you hope that your family has an unusual surname or someone has an unusual name, so that perhaps in the particular locality it will be easy for their name to jump out and find you. Otherwise, you're going to get hundreds of potential. You want to avoid rework, so organization is of prime importance. I suggest that you start by using the printed forms that were presented at the initial opening of this presentation, the ancestral chart, as well as the family group sheet. Keep a 3-ring notebook or a directory on your computer to download and save or print out and save information. I can guarantee you on the 3-ring notebook, you're going to start out with one, but you're going to want to expand as you get further into this. Always identify supplies with your name, address, phone number, and an email address. If you happen to go to a library or a family history center and leave something behind, you want to make sure that people are able to get it back to you and get in touch with you. You may want to start with a single notebook, but you may want to move to separate notebooks for each family name with dividers for the various generations. The organization is very, very difficult. It's what makes sense to you, but it is very important. You want to avoid having to recopy notes. You want to avoid wasting time, and you want to avoid introducing errors into your own work. And you want to put all of the original documentation into archival quality protective sheets. They are available at many of the office supply, and you want to look for something that is acid-free or lignin-free. The acid-free is the critical issue, so that photographs and original documents should be placed in those. So with that, I want to thank you for coming this morning and entertain any questions.
So just a reminder for the questions, you can send them in the chat function, and that is at the bottom of the screen if you're using a computer. If you're using a phone or an iPad or some other thing like that, I'm not quite sure where it will appear on there, but if you're on a computer, it will show up at the bottom. Just a little chat function.
We'll give you a couple of minutes just to see if they're...
Diane said thank you so much, very helpful.
If not, once again, I want to thank the staff at the museum for helping to sponsor this program. And I want to say thank you to each one of you who came this morning. And be sure to check back on the museum's website or in social media, whether it be Facebook or other social media, for future sessions that we will be introducing. Hopefully have... Yes?
Do you have a question? Where do you get the passport information?
The passport information, Ancestry.com does have some passport information online. They do have a lot of the applications, and make sure to look at both sides. There will be probably 2 pages, a front page with the factual information and a back page with a description of the person and the potential picture. You can also, National Archives also maintains passport information, but the easiest resource at this point is probably Ancestry. I'll wait another couple of minutes just in case there are any further questions. But once again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you hopefully in future sessions.
And this was our very first virtual one, so we thank you for joining us for that. And if you do have any suggestions, please feel free to let us know. We are hoping to keep going with this virtual thing for the time being. And so, thank you.
Have a good Saturday, everyone. Thank you.
And if you do think of a question after, you can always email the museum and we will get that question sent to Terry and let you know. All right.
Appreciate it. Bye now.